Well, I've been asked to reminisce a little bit about Ed Dougherty. My memories of Ed are quite vivid. I met Ed for the first time while I was working at KBZY in Salem, Oregon. I'd emceed a bunch of shows for Pat Mason before I met Ed. We were all over Oregon with artists including Dick and Dee Dee and the Ventures and Gene Vincent, Rick Nelson, a whole bunch of rock, pretty early pioneers. And I'd grown to respect Pat Mason as being the premier concert promoter in the Pacific Northwest. So along comes this school teacher who has had no previous experience that I knew of promoting concerts. And he wanted to promote rock concerts at the Armory Auditorium in Salem. And he asked me to MC the shows. Well, my first attraction to Ed was that he was willing to pay me some pretty decent money to MC the concerts. The second thing that really attracted me to Ed, and he'll remember this as well as anybody, Ed bought clothes for me. I never had the kind of clothes that an MC ought to wear. I had just regular street clothes, but Ed made it a point to show me how important it was to dress like a performer, like an entertainer. Ed would take me down to Schrock's Menswear and buy me great clothes, sport coats and slacks, and really Ed prepared me image-wise to be an MC and to be a celebrity. And at that time, rock and roll disc jockeys were celebrities. I had moved from KGAY radio in Salem over to KBZY, and that's where the name Jim Hunter first appeared on the radio. I remember I'd recorded a song called I Love to Be With You, and Ed used to take me aside and say, if you don't learn to sing like Mark Lindsay of Paul Revere and the Raiders, you'll never amount to anything as a singer. I had a totally different style than Mark Lindsay as a singer, but I tried to live up to Ed's expectations, and it just never worked out right, combining my personal style with what I thought Mark Lindsay's style was. Ed introduced me to some of the biggest rock stars in the history of rock and roll, including Sonny and Cher. I really got well acquainted with Paul Revere and the Raiders. That was an act that came back time and time again to the Armory Auditorium. And we worked with Paul Revere and the Raiders so often that we all got to know each other and we got to be friends. I remember one night after I had moved from Salem to Portland and Kissin' Radio, Ed invited me to go to the top of the Cosmo to have dinner. And he said, we're going to meet Jim Valley, who I believe at the time was working with Don and the Good Times. And he said, Jim wants me to make some suggestions as to whether or not he should go to work with Paul Revere and the Raiders. And I thought, what an interesting dinner to be a part of, where a guy working with one rock and roll group that I respected tremendously was thinking about joining Paul Revere and the Raiders, biggest group in the Pacific Northwest at the time. It just didn't get bigger than that. And so I sat at that dinner and listened to Ed and Jim Valley talk about whether or not Jim should move over to Paul Revere and the Raiders. And it was Ed's advice, as I recall, that he make the move. And Jim was apprehensive about it. Didn't know for sure whether he could live up to what Paul wanted him to do in the band. Didn't know whether he could really learn all of the dance steps and the moves. I was at that meeting. And that was not unusual for Ed to be right at the heart of some of the biggest decisions that were being made in rock and roll at the time. Ed's expertise was tapped into by people like Sonny and Cher. I'm sure the Everly Brothers, certainly a lot by Paul Revere and the Raiders. And Ed became known as one of the top rock and roll impresarios in the Pacific Northwest, bar none. One day, Ed called me and said, we're going to go to Seattle, and we're going to go up and meet some rock and roll artists, and I'm going to take you up to meet Pat O'Day from KJR Radio. KJR was a station that I would love to have worked for. And we went to Seattle, and I remember that evening, I met the Mamas and the Papas, had an interesting experience with Mama Cass that I'll tell you about in a bit. I met Marilee Rush, I met Johnny Rivers, I met Jan and Dean. I remember one time we were driving back in Ed's car from the airport. We had picked up Sonny and Cher and their manager, a guy by the name, I believe it was Harold Batiste. We arrived at the Senator Hotel in Salem. I'll never forget this. Sonny and Cher in the back of Ed's car. And we got out of the car at the Senator Hotel. Sonny and Cher walking along behind us into the Senator Hotel to check into their room. And Cher was a space cadet. There was no question in my mind this woman was spaced out big time. Sonny was like a father. He was kind of the guide and the strong member of that duo. And as we walked down the hallway on the way to their room, there was a little kind of a triangular tear in the wallpaper on the wall. And as we passed it, Cher reached over and grabbed it and kept walking. And as she walked, the triangular tear in that wallpaper spread out in both directions until she had a piece of wallpaper that was about 6 feet tall in her hand. And suddenly, Sonny looked back and said, "Cher, let that thing go." And she just dropped it on the floor. I'll never forget. I looked back. There was about 20 feet of wallpaper gone from the wall in the Senator Hotel. And Cher, just with this dreamy look on her face, like a deer in the headlights, looked at Sonny and said, "Sonny, I've never been in Seattle before." We weren't in Seattle. We were in Salem. Just one of those weird memories that popped into my mind about being with Ed Dougherty and the strange things that occurred every time I was around him. I remember the night that we went to Seattle for that big concert with Johnny Rivers and the Mamas and the Papas, and Dino, Desi, and Billy were on that concert. And we went into the dressing room, and the Mamas and the Papas were getting ready to go on stage, and Mama Cass stayed behind. She was such a kick and so easy to talk to and such a sweet woman. And as we stood there talking to her, and she kind of was sizing me up, and I couldn't tell why, but she seemed fascinated by me for some reason. And I later learned I was so small and so skinny. And she finally turned around to me and she said, "Jim, have you ever swung with a big I had no idea how to answer that question. I said, "No, I guess I haven't." She said, "Well, you're about ready to." And she went around behind me and slipped her arms under my arms and picked me up and swung me around the room with my feet flying straight out in front of me. And people were just ducking and diving to get out of the way. Another one of those strange Ed Dougherty moments. Oh, here's one for you. When Ed booked Sonny and Cher at the Armory Auditorium in Salem, he worried that the act was not going to do very well. He had gotten them, I think, at a bargain price. Previously, they'd been Caesar and Cleopatra, and they had changed their name from Caesar and Cleopatra to Sonny and Cher. And someone tipped Ed off that they had a great song that was bound to be a big hit, and Ed spent some money booking them into the Armory Auditorium, but he got cold feet and was afraid the show was not going to go over and we wouldn't pull a crowd for the show. I was scheduled to MC the show, and Ed said, "Look, in an effort to pull a crowd for the show, I'm going to get a barber in Salem to give you a razor haircut on stage, and I want you to talk about it on the air. And people will become intrigued by this, and they'll show up for the concert to see you get your haircut on stage, so it doesn't really matter whether Sonny and Cher are any good at all or not. We're going to pull a crowd to see you get your haircut." That's how desperate he was. So the night that Sonny and Cher appear, they are the #1 rock and roll act in the world. But we'd already contacted the barber. We'd already made a deal to let the barber cut my hair on stage. So there I was, on stage with the #1 rock and roll act in the entire world, having my hair cut, while Sonny and Cher sang, "I Got You, Babe." A surreal moment that wouldn't have happened without Ed Dougherty.